All right, folks. The 1840s, very prosperous time. It's a time of gold. It's also a time that the white man sincerely shows his true colors. A very big story here about a freed man who was kidnapped and sold as a slave. And when he was found out, he brought his captives to court, and they never got the justice they deserved. So he will be honored on this page, and I hope you enjoy our segment. This will lead to ultimate war, and it also brings light on the Black Lives Matter movement of today. Not a whole lot has changed over the years, unfortunately. The only thing that has changed is actual slavery, and even that hasn't changed in some places. So, truth is truth. Let's do it. Hello, friends. It's Harry here with another run here. This is, we're getting into the 1840s now. Gold rush fever time. A lot goes on here that prepares us for what seems to be inevitably a conflict in America. But this time everybody knows it. Everybody from race to creed to politicians. Abraham Lincoln has already even discussed it. So we'll see what happens. On March 4th, 1841, President William Henry Harrison delivers his inaugural speech. He delivers it outside for 2 hours in the bitter cold. Exactly 1 month later, on April 4th, 1841, President William Henry Harrison dies of pneumonia from that very speech, leaving his presidency to his vice president, John Tyler. A true story of the legalities of hatred in America. Solomon Northup was the son of a freeman, and he was an abolitionist. He was a musician. He played the violin, and two white people, naturally, offered him a job in Washington, D.C. in a musical group, get his name on up there in lights, so to speak, and he took the job. This was all a trick. He was drugged and he was sold to a slave owner and salesman in Washington, D.C. where this was perfectly legal, and it didn't matter if he was a freeman or not. If he was sold into slavery, he was a slave, and he was sold around to several um, buyers. One treated him with respect. Some others treated him with such horrid lashing that knowing that he lived through this to tell his story was just an amazing act of God. Um, but his family intervened and was able to legally bring him back to New York. And he was freed once again. This is where he wrote his biography, 12 Years a Slave. Very powerful and moving story. It was also made into a movie. It's very well worth reading, very well worth watching. Uh, it is a step toward understanding the um, Black Lives Matter movement. Um, this is historical, and it is not the same today as it was back then. There is still a lot of this going on a moral basis. It is a very, very powerful and moving story, and um, Solomon is honored today, and he is honored on this page. The Oregon Trail, leading from Missouri all the way to Oregon. Almost 3,000 miles of road. And this is where everyone wanted to be, especially in 1843 when you heard the cry, "There's gold in them there hills." Now, everyone is getting rich, especially the fur traders. This was Canadian territory. It was settled in a treaty later on in years by America. It has become American territory, and the gold in the area is stripped. This is the gold rush fever period. It begins now, and it's not going to stop for a good long time. In May of 1844, Samuel Morse sent the first telegram. He sent that from the U.S. Capitol all the way to Baltimore. Wow, that was quite a trip. People are learning to communicate in code, which obviously would be named Morse code. This lasts for literally over 100 years. It's not until the internet that has replaced this goes all the way up to the 1980s and some of the 90s, and some people still use it even today. Very, very useful tool for communication, and it all started with Morse. Um, so the communication that he sent, he tried to think of some awesome words to send to be able to communicate. Well, it wasn't him who came up with the words. It was actually the daughter of a friend of his who came up with the words, and this is what he sent. He sent the scripture passage from the Bible, uh, Numbers 23:23, which reads, "What hath God rot. Those are the first words that were sent overseas or overland, whichever way you want to look at it. But Morse code is created, and so is communication, which will obviously lead to the telephone. So, January 23rd, 1845, we come up with a new law. Presidential elect will not be official at the polls until the first Tuesday after the first Monday of the month of November. On March 1st, 1845, President John Tyler bids his farewell by annexing the largest amount of geography to the United States, and that is Texas.
Shut the front door.
What the hell? Come back now.
So let's talk about this man, Frederick Douglass, the power behind the wheel when it comes to African American freedom. This is one story that ends very, very triumphantly for the African American community. It is the first real success story in African American heritage. This man was a true abolitionist. He fought against slavery with everything he had, and it was all in peace. There was no violence about him. He was a writer, and he wrote columns, books, everything about the situation. And he made such intelligence that people in the North, white people, people of prestige, read his writings and could not believe that not only was he of African American heritage, but that at one time he was a slave himself. And he rose all above that. He became part of the government and wrote his autobiography in May of 1845. And this success of his led to a great deal of success when it came to the future of the African American human being. He preceded Abraham Lincoln. We think of Abraham Lincoln as the one who started this all. It wasn't. He just allowed it as far as being a law, and he's the only one that could. But it was this man and many like him that led the African American community to freedom. And if that is not successful enough of a story, he received a standing ovation from his peers and from many white Americans on his lectures and his talks. And he was not one of these who was caught and hanged. He lived to be a ripe old age, very, very respected by most everyone in the country, mostly the northern side, and he is honored to this day as a great human being. It was he who led the African American to be able to be a free thinker like those who sit before you. God bless you. So this story is pretty graphic. If you are weak of heart or weak of stomach, this is probably not a good story for you to watch. I'd encourage you to turn it forward. This is the Franklin expedition. Over 100 men took 2 ships and went to explore uncharted territory in Canada. Both ships got lost at sea and ended up in the icy regions where they shipwrecked. And there they remained to unfortunately die a very untimely death. Very slow and very painful death. Frozen, diseased, starving, to the point where once they were found, scientists have issued the discovery of cannibalism, and they all froze in this ice. This is a long time later, obviously. 2014, they came up with mummified remains of specifically 3 crewmen. But initially, before the first search, they were already gone for over a year. And to this day, they were actually brought back and specifically put in a museum, artifacts and mummies themselves. This was a very, very tragic end to what started out to be a great venture and exploration, and unfortunately met with a very, very bitter end. And speaking of tragedy, we come to the Great Potato Famine of Ireland, which lasted from 1845 to 1854, destroying crops throughout the land and sending people to their starvation death. Over 1,100,000 people were consumed in this famine. It was the greatest famine in Ireland to this day. Anyone who was able to survive made the voyage away from Ireland. One of the, if not the greatest exodus of the land of Ireland. The famine actually returned years later in 1879. The government did intervene, but the help that they could provide was hardly enough to keep people from dying of starvation. This was a very tragic moment for the entire region of Ireland, and God willing, will never be seen again. In April of 1846, Mexico attacked a troop of American soldiers and overpowered them. So the word got back to the government, and it brought bad blood between America and Mexico. On May 13th of the same year, America declares war on Mexico.
Oh, there's a big surprise! That's an incredible... I think I'm gonna
This
have a
war
heart attack and
will
die from that
last
surprise!
for almost 2 years before a treaty is signed and Mexico allows America to take over its territories and become part of the United States. This will go from the panhandle of Texas all the way up to California, Colorado, Arizona, and all the surrounding areas, completing what looks like the shape of the American continent. Okay, so from April to August of 1846, this man, Francis Parkman, he traveled the Oregon Trail. He discovered a lot of new ways of life from cultures, Native Americans, local Indians, and learned life outside of human venture, animals, plants, all this stuff. A lot of these discoveries were very much similar to the Louisiana Purchase discoveries. But he took notes while he went on, had his own journal, and published it into a book entitled The Oregon Trail. It is a very, very good novel. I've read it myself. I do encourage it. It's very good reading. And now, in summer also of 1846, we've got settlers in California. Now that we've taken over and Mexico has surrendered, people are coming in from all over the place to settle in California. Well, the people from Mexico who live in California are not willing to give it up so easily. So they launch the Bear Flag Revolt. And they fight the settlers. Settlers are too many, though, and they conquer the Mexicans that are there. And so what happens with every American settler is they settle in California, and the Mexicans are driven out. Speaking of settling in California, this brings us to the infamous Donner Party, or also what is known as the Donner-Reed Party. They are a group of settlers from the Midwest, 87 to be exact, who go on the Oregon Trail to settle in California with everybody else, and they make a fateful decision on the way. There is a quicker way to get there. So they take off from anybody else who's going on the Oregon Trail to find their own. And they get stuck in snowdrifts to the point where they are stranded. They are lost, and they begin to freeze. This is in November, and after a month, they are running out of supplies, and they are starving and freezing. Those who are able to break away try to find sources of help to help the party get to California. By the time they have rescue attempts that reach the Donner Party, it is already February. This is months later now. About half, maybe a little more than half, survive the winter cold due to trying somehow to stay warm and stay alive. They also have to resort to cannibalism. People who are dying off, they are being eaten by the survivors so that they can survive. They are brought to California, and this is supposed to be the glorious time that they are to celebrate. And because of this instance, their lives will never be the same. Very, very tragic story for those who died. Very tragic story for those who've lived. And it's also one of the most, if not the most tragic story for California itself. During the Mexican-American War, the American Army conquered the Mexican Army at the Battle of Buena Vista on February 22nd of 1847, and conquered them a second time in March in the Battle of Veracruz. On June 1st, 1847, technological genius Cornelius Vanderbilt raced his steamboat against Daniel Drew, losing to Drew. Thousands of New Yorkers showed up to see this surprising defeat. There's one good way to get your name in the papers, huh? Throughout the deadly heat of the summer months of 1847, most unfortunately, the potato famine of Ireland continues to rage on. In September of 1847, the American Army successfully make foot in Mexico City and conquer the city and end the war once and for all between the Mexicans and the Americans. In December of 1847, Abraham Lincoln begins his 2-year term in the House of Representatives before returning to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. This man, James Marshall, was a mechanical engineer. He was also a carpenter. Went into business with John Sutter to create the Sutter Mill in California. And business tycoons that they were going to make a big business. Now we've got a new and updated gold rush. He discovers some rocks that are unusual and reports that he finds gold. Now we've got a gold rush going on in California, throughout the country. Interestingly enough, to the dismay, you'd think that this would give them the opportunity to be completely wealthy beyond their means. But neither James Marshall nor John Sutter benefited from the gold or the sawmill itself, period.
What the hell?
The sawmill never got off the ground, and both of them died almost penniless. This was around January of 1828 that this happened. On February 23rd, 1828, former President John Quincy Adams serving as congressman, collapses in the U.S. Capitol itself and dies. During the time that we engage in anti-slavery, anti-color, the act of freedom, all men should be free. During the time when the country is at complete odds on this subject, there is one thing we forget, and that is the one being who has been forgotten as the silent partner through all of this. Is this a form of slavery? It is the very essence and being of woman. This woman right here, Lucretia Mott, she put her name on the map in 1833, and she was an abolitionist. She did marry, and her husband fought for this cause on freeing slaves. But one slave that has not been heard is this, the very essence of woman. She was a very large activist toward abolitionists, and she was also encouraging her peers, her higher uppers, and the country itself to recognize the rights of women, that women have a voice, and that they should be free to be able to speak their mind. And this was not the case. We hear people speaking of anti-slavery in public. She was never allowed to because she was a woman. Anyone in authority would shut her down because she was a woman. Any public gathering where anyone would have the opportunity to speak, she was shut down. This is where she decided it was time to speak up. She used the authority of her own voice and her husband's voice to be heard. She started a society of women, and those women band together for a greater cause. And they finally got the attention of the government in 1858. A huge step for women's liberation. A very proud time. Liberation for women would not come for years later. From 1920 to the 1960s. It wasn't until the 1920s that women was even allowed to vote. But during her lifetime, she was able to direct the course of this yawl to the point where she was allowed to own her own home outside of her husband. This was the right that was given to women. And similar to it is a huge step in women's liberation. And it all started with this woman. This is Lucretia Mott, the one who started it all. And she is honored on this page for the power to women. At the end of 1848, on December 8th, President Polk confirms the discovery of gold throughout California. Now everybody wants in. We turn our attentions now to the year 1850. Throughout 1849, we have tried to figure out some kind of peaceful way to go about the country as a whole so we do not get a self-inflicted conflict. So now we come to the Compromise of 1850. It is a compromise on the country that has to do with rules on slavery. 5 different laws that are passed to settle conflicts, specifically between the North and the South. There are some states who are allowed to do what they will with their slaves. There are states that are allowed to have freemen. There are also laws on the protection of white Americans who have lost their slaves to their escape, to easily catch and bring them back to their slave owners. That's specifically in the South. That's specifically in Texas. But the Compromise of 1850 seems to work for all Americans in question, which are the legal Americans, and that generally has to do with white population. And so this offsets the conflict for another decade or so before we realize that, again, all men should be free. And we won't start this conflict until then. But for right now, we got it settled in bills to kind of stop any kind of conflict whining on the South Side or anything like this. And for the moment, it seems like it should be agreeable. On February 1st, 1850, tragedy strikes. The second son of Abraham Lincoln dies of tuberculosis only 1 month before his 4th birthday. Doctors have later discovered that symptoms leading to his death were more along the lines of medullary thyroid cancer. His wake and funeral were held at Abraham Lincoln's home, which actually was very common at a time all the way up until even the early part of the 20th century. Who would wake their family in their own home. So his coffin was on display in Lincoln's home, and he was laid to rest in Hutchinson Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. So the Illinois Daily Journal wrote on the Lincoln's behalf for their beloved 3-year-old son, almost 4, these words: "Those midnight stars are sadly dimmed, that late so brilliantly shined, and though the crimson tinge from cheek and lip, with the heart's warm life has flown, the angel death was hovering nigh, and the lovely boy was called to die. The silken waves of his glossy hair lies still over his marble brow, and the pallid lip and pearly cheek the presence of death avow. Pure little bud in kindness given, in mercy taken to bloom in heaven. Happier far is the angel child with the harp and the crown of gold, who warbles now at the Savior's feet, the glories to us untold. Eddie, meet blossom of heavenly love, dwells in the spirit world above. Angel boy, fare thee well, farewell. Sweet Eddie, we bid thee adieu. Affection's wail cannot reach thee now, deep though it be and true. Bright is the home to him now given, for of such the love kingdom of heaven.